Shalom everyone, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye and welcome to this 4-part series, Roadmap for Living, Resisting Tyranny. This is part 2 and we're going to talk about deconstructing the gods of this world. So one of the things we find in the ancient world is the gods wanted to enslave people and they wanted people to worship their image. And so our goal here is to show how Israel functioned differently, how they had an alternate worldview and how they didn't submit to the world of the gods. Deconstructing the world of the gods was very important for ancient Israel. That world enslaved them, enslaved all the peoples of that ancient time. And God himself gave Israel an alternate worldview in the ancient Near East world. Israel, as we talked about in our last session, was a nation that functioned most of its time under military powers, other military powers. But it was that God gave to them a radically different view of things. So the Bible, in essence, and we talked about how the backdrop of the Bible was political, but it tells the story of how to dismantle these gods, because the ancient world lived in that world. They functioned under these gods. The gods governed their lives in every way and manner you could imagine. And so it was up to the writers, the biblical writers, to deconstruct the myths that the ancient world was familiar with. These were very popular myths, myths that had to do with creation, myths that had to do with the flood. Their world was filled with them. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about the idea of what a myth is, because we don't really, in our modern world, we don't really understand it. And we just look at it as sort of fictional accounts. They're not true. It's all made up. And again, these were popular myths, and in the Bible, they were going to be reworked. They were going to be challenged and transformed in order for the children of Israel to align themselves with God's revelation of who He was. And so, as I mentioned, the popular myths of the flood, the creation story, God wanted Israel to think differently about itself in relationship to the world. And again, this has to go back to the subversive message that we have. So the book of Genesis is really written in reaction to the myths of the ancient world. And through the book of Genesis, we see a very different narrative. It would have been very different to the known world. They would have responded because it stood outside of what they were familiar with. So the Bible stories, especially in the book of Genesis, function within a historical setting. But books like Genesis told an alternative, radical story on how they needed to live. It told the story of the purpose of who the people are and why God created them, what they were, what God was like to them, how they could approach Him, how they could relate to God in this present time in the world in which they lived. And so the emphasis became on the historical events in the Bible and how God miraculously intervened in those events and overcame very real obstacles. Of course, Exodus comes to mind, and Exodus, the story of Exodus and the delivery, has every bit to do with the gods, the separation and deliverance from the gods of Egypt. And so deconstructing these gods enabled Israel to see that she was not at the mercy of these gods, and that in fact Israel was a kingdom citizen, a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And so the call to the Gentile nations, the Bible tells that the call to the Gentile nations was to worship Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh. And sometimes in our modern world, we describe this as sort of being spiritual. That's how we sort of define that call for the nations to worship God. And again, I mentioned that the world in which they lived was a very political world. Even though they were called to be separate from it, they were still in it. And for them, and not so much for us now, but there was no division between the physical world in which they lived and the sort of spiritual world. And the reflection of their behavior, of human behavior, they didn't describe it as not being spiritual because there wasn't a divide or a separation between the two. But the idea was, how do you live? How do you make the choices for living? How do you worship the God of Israel and not the gods of this world? And in the ancient world, the people believed that the gods were initially content to live without human beings. And so the gods created the cosmos for themselves. And within that cosmos, they build great cities. That's one of the things you find about the ancient world. They identified power with building cities. I find that to be very interesting as well. And it was said that the gods grew tired of feeding themselves and having to build their houses and clothing, so they were going to find other ways to do that. They didn't want to dig ditches anymore for irrigation or for growing crops, so they created human beings as slave labor. And we could argue that the oldest vocation in the world is slavery. Slavery goes back to the dawn of time, in which the gods created humans to serve their beck and call. And so this is the very heartbeat in nature as we see world empire rise up, is to enslave human beings. Humans have been enslaved throughout the entire course of history. And that enslavement made the elites more powerful. They enriched themselves off the backs of humans who worked for them. And again, this is nothing new under the sun. This is what we see today. In fact, we could argue today that there's probably more human slavery in this 21st century than there has been in all of human history. So one of the things in the ancient world, the public was called to worship the image of the god. So the image was the deity's presence. Whoever that deity was, the image represented the presence of that deity and became the center of their rituals and ceremonies, etc. So for example, a human would, the god would be awakened in the morning by the human. The human would wash his clothes, would wash the god. He would dress him, clothe him, feed him, and prepare him for bed. Gods and goddesses, I should include. So the worship of the gods included caring for the needs of the god. And it was that the gods relied solely on human beings for their needs to be met. And again, all of these, the rituals and ceremonies and cultic activities were all in the context of how the humans took care of the god. I mentioned in our last episode that eating and drinking was kind of the highest order in the ancient world. And ultimately, it was the way that humans would serve the god, by providing food and drink for them. Humans would be responsible, in particular the king would oversee the building of the temple to house the god. So the care of the gods ensured that continued presence of the deity in their midst. And so the question for people always was, well, did we actually meet the gods' needs? And so the gods were treated with great deference. They were recognized to need luxury, so humans provided for that. On the other side, the gods were very easily offended, so everything was about working to make sure they were happy. You worked to make sure the gods were appeased. And so the idea in that culture for maintaining justice was supposed to be the job of the gods, but they didn't do a good job of it, if you will. that responsibility eventually became delegated to the king. And so the king, the people counted on the king to maintain the favor of the god. So the king was an important intermediary between the folks and the deity. And he was responsible for a lot of different things, but again, to make sure the god was happy. So we have all these elements of ritual worship and the religious world, the criminal justice world, if you will, the civilian law, all functioned in that realm. Central to the governance of the ancient Near East world and its societies, we see that order was tantamount. Order and wisdom were attributes that were very important for the functioning of that world. And all in that environment, imagine you have Israel, this nation set apart, separate, holy unto God, that functions in a radically different and alternative way from the rest of the world. And so when Israel made an offering to their God, to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, it wasn't to appease an angry God. The idea for Israel was to draw near. The Hebrew word we have is karav, out of which we get the offerings. The korbanot, the singular korban. It was to draw near in relationship in order for the children of Israel to be transformed. And opposite to the world of the gods of the ancient Near East is that God took care of his people. He provided their needs. They didn't provide for his needs. And so Israel worshiped in response to that loving care that God provided for them. And all of this comes back to what we call a covenantal relationship. And so this idea of a covenantal relationship at its heart was oriented around family. Of course, we had families and clans and tribes, etc. But that covenantal relationship that Israel had with her God, that was the essence. And the family is tied to this covenant relationship. And again, this is an example of subverting world empire, because that's not how the world of the ancients functioned. The only thing that mattered in that world were the gods and the kings who ruled over their human subjects, who were mere commodities for them. God operates completely opposite from this. The gods of this world would seek to destroy, and in that, the family was a victim of that. And of course, we see that today. The number one victim of the global cabal that seeks to dominate the world is to destroy the human family, because the human family functioned as a bulwark against this type of oppression. So for Israel, in response to God's provision and care, they gave offerings of thanksgiving and honor, and they declared their allegiance to God. And Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh was not like any other god, because he had no needs. He didn't need humans to care for him and take care of him. He would provide for his people. And so we had talked about the image that the deity would create an image of himself in order for the people to be able to worship. Often that image was reflected in the king. But Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh didn't need an image to mediate care between him and his people, or his image. And so all of Israel's rituals and ceremonies were functioned in the realm of covenant. And so they were responsible, of course, for bringing offerings. They were responsible to maintain the sacred space in which God had set apart for himself and his people. And the purpose in all of that was to preserve his presence in the midst of them. Because if they violated that, they violated the covenant, then the relationship that they had with God was broken, and he no longer was obligated to remain in the midst of them until that covenant was restored. And so all of the covenant obligations came by a covenant agreement. And people served Yahweh, the children of Israel served Yahweh through faithfulness. And like other kings, in a way, he was responsible, or the king was, to maintain justice and order in that environment. An interesting quote from Dr. John Walton, he said that the ancient Near East world gods have jobs, while the king, why God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, has a plan. And that our God does not have whims like the gods. You never knew. They were capricious. You never knew what they were going to do next. Now, it is the case that sometimes his actions could be incomprehensible, but the covenant was always the foundation of that relationship, of God's role as a national deity for Israel, and the covenant dictated that behavior. There was something called covenant fidelity, which we translate as faithfulness or loyalty. Again, all based on allegiance to the king. In essence, the idea of worship, not worshiping the gods, but worshiping God himself, that was the goal, or the telos in Greek, the goal of creation. It wasn't the end of creation, it was the goal of creation to worship God, and this would set the pattern for worshiping the king. The climax of all of creation was the Sabbath, and it was at the Sabbath in which the king was enthroned. That's when he took the throne. We see that in the order of Genesis chapter 1. And once the king was enthroned, the newly crowned king, order would come to that sphere. So we can think of Yeshua when he was crucified on the tree. That was a recreation moment, and of course it functioned subversively. You didn't see this happen in any other nation. The purpose of Yeshua, to draw heaven and earth together, to launch a new kingdom, to defeat the dark powers of this world, which we could say were the oppressors, the tyrants and the dictators and the world leaders that would oppress the people. He came to launch a very different kingdom. And his actions ultimately functioned in deconstructing the gods of Rome. Now remember, there's a whole lot of gods. Through the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Persians and finally into Rome, myriads and myriads of gods who controlled and ruled everything. I would suggest, in essence, the world of the gods functioned much like the ruling elites over an empire. So there would be a king, and then all his officials and all his court officials and all those that had power over the people, and they controlled them and enslaved them. And so the idea of Yeshua on the tree was that he overthrew those dark powers that had enslaved the people. And the people had been abused by these elites. And in the part 3 of this series, we're going to go into more detail in terms of the gospel message. And I would encourage you too that along with this particular is part 2 of this story, you can find our special edition at israeltvnetwork.tv. And you can learn more about it in this particular program, how the ancient gods functioned and how Israel's God functioned in opposition to that. So I would like to go back just for a second and talk about the creation pattern, because I know for most of us, we see creation as material origins and how God created the heavens and the earth. But there's something even more important there, and that is how God created a cosmos, how he created a kingdom, how he installed his king to rule over that kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And the entire structure of the creation, the king was called to maintain creation, but the entire structure was one of worship. Again, I mentioned the telos of worship. The goal of creation is to worship the king. So tucked away in the Genesis story of the creation story are some things that have to do with what we would call the rituals and ceremonies of the cult of Israel. So for example, it keeps reminding us through Genesis 1, and it was evening and it was morning, day 1 day, evening and morning, and so on. And that is also a reflection of the creation, because the pattern for worship in the temple, for example, had to do with evening and morning. That is when they brought their offerings in the temple to the altar, and the animal was slain and the blood was applied by the priests. And it was always in the evening and in the morning. Those were the times. We think based on the first century, 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, which was considered evening. So all of these ritual ceremonies are reflected in creation. And we can see this as well when we go to Genesis 1:14, and it talks in there about these appointed times to meet the king. And we call them the Moedim, the times and the seasons. And it mentions the lights and the expanse and the signs and the seasons in the sky. And so the Moedim, the appointed times for Israel, when they came, when they approached, remember they're in a covenant relationship. When did they draw near? So we had appointed times that were daily, appointed times that were weekly, some were monthly, and some were annual. And interesting too, in the Jewish prayer book, in the Siddur, every prayer always pretty well starts the same way. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe. Over and over and over again, that declaration that He is King over the universe. He is the head of that governmental structure called the cosmos. And so it was that every Jewish prayer acknowledged the kingship of God. Now, when we go to the story of Egypt, of course, the Exodus is one of the most important stories in all of Scripture. And of course, the Jews tell of the story of this great deliverance from Egypt. It's in everything. And we even see the measure of this in the New Testament. If you read Revelation, for example, you see all these various plagues, etc. It is a replay, a retelling of the story of the Exodus. And so what did the children of Israel needed to be delivered? And from whom? Yes, Pharaoh, because he was king, and he functioned as a god in ancient Egypt, but they needed to be delivered from all of the gods of ancient Egypt. And so the Exodus story deconstructs those gods. Now, it was said in Egypt they had over 1,500 different gods over a period of time. So that was a lot. Imagine 1,500 people, gods, telling you what you could and couldn't do and how your life was supposed to function. So their deliverance came by dethroning Egypt's gods. And so the plagues were, of course, symbols of chaos. But what it showed was Pharaoh had no control. Like this would have functioned 180 degrees opposite of what they were used to, because Pharaoh was responsible to maintain order. And now everything is out of order. The plagues have come, and Pharaoh is not controlling this thing. Another god is. And so he is showing his inability to maintain order. This is a big deal in the ancient world. He was powerless to stop it. And so it was that God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, shamed those false gods, and he displayed his majesty and his power, and he showed his power over all the gods. And the worst thing in the ancient world was to be shamed. Honor was of more value than anything else in the ancient world. And so to shame the gods, we can't even imagine what that was like. And so Egypt's gods represented various facets of life. They, of course, had authority over the Nile River, which is the most important element in all of Egypt, to provide food for the people, the fertile land that it provided because of the silt. And these gods they ruled over the fertility and the crops and the sun, all these sort of things. But the gods functioned much like the mafia in extorting people, in bribery, etc. And they demanded to be appeased, or else they would pour out their wrath. And again, it points to Pharaoh, who was responsible to maintain all this. And something he was responsible to maintain was justice as well. The word used there is ma'at. He was expected, Pharaoh was, to protect the people against the forces of chaos. Can you imagine what the people are thinking when they see how weak and impotent Pharaoh is, and that this other god is ruling over them? A divine power was now working against Egypt, and that God was performing miraculous deliverance of Israel in the midst of this, and that the gods of the world who enslaved, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, was deconstructing their world. And so we will be talking more about this in the special edition. I will pick up on this particular theme in the special edition that goes with this, and you can go to israeltvnetwork.tv to see how the biblical story worked to subvert world empire. And so God basically was taking down that world. This is very important. And so the Exodus story is probably the best example of how the subversive message of Israel was operating. And so I would encourage you to really reread the New Testament with new eyes, because the Exodus story, it's not like you just read it in the book of Exodus, end of story, you move on. The story of the deliverance of the children of Israel can be found in absolutely everything, and we see this especially in the New Testament, because it is the case that Yeshua is just replaying Moses throughout the New Testament. Especially you're reading in the book of Matthew, and you can see him following along the same sort of storyline as Moses. You're seeing him do the same thing that Moses did to deliver their people, but ultimately, of course, he gave up his life. He restored heaven and earth hanging on that tree in order for the new kingdom to be launched, in order for the cosmos to function the way it was supposed to function under the rulership of God. And to see this opposition between the kings of this world and the kingdoms of our God, this is the message for us today. How are we going to function in that context? That we understand who our God is, and yet we see the kings of this world exercising power and control and enslaving people, and that the people are crying out for deliverance. And folks, things are going to get a lot more difficult, and if we don't understand our covenantal relationship with Him, we will perish. I don't know what's ahead, but I do know the one who is ahead. And so we commit ourselves to that covenant relationship, to restore order for heaven and earth, and to bring a profound order and justice into that sphere. Thank you. See you next time.